Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Janet Archer. I'm the Director of Festival, Cultural and City Events at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to be your host this evening for Edinburgh Cultural Conversations. So I want to say a few thanks before we begin. Thank you to everyone at the university who's helped make this series happen, especially the Festivals, Cultural and City Events team. And a special thank you to the artists, creatives, academics and cultural leaders who are contributing as panelists across the series, which forms part of the global debate on how to make sense of culture in this time of coronavirus. Thank you too to the Edinburgh Futures Institute, who are our partners for this event. EFI is all about bringing people together to solve global challenges and build a sustainable future, vitally important before COVID, but even more essential now. Thank you to Donna Jewell and Greg Colloon from Just Sign, who've joined us for the series as our BSL interpreters. And I want to say that all of our previous events have been uploaded to our website, and if you want to watch them. And thank you to everyone who've been along to all of them. There are a few people who've been following the series right through, and we'd be really interested in everyone's feedback. You can contact us on festivals@ed.ac.uk. The series is taking place against the backdrop of the world's biggest festival city, successful because of its extraordinary community of festivals, large and small. 2020 is the first year since 1947 that the spring and summer festivals haven't been able to take place. It feels really important to mark this moment and capture how the arts and creative sectors can help society recover from the effects of COVID-19. This year, people from around the world are engaging with the festivals in a different way through an impressive range of online work. The Edinburgh International Book Festival is delivering 140 events for adults, families and children online over the course of the next few weeks. The International Festival, the Fringe Society and the Edinburgh Art Festival are also presenting digital programmes showcasing some extraordinary work by artists from across disciplines. And this evening, we've got an exceptional panel with us who are going to talk about the programmes that they've been delivering during this period, which are also extraordinary. It's good that these programmes have been able to generate much needed employment in a time when coronavirus has sharply accentuated the tight margins most UK cultural organisations deal with. It's hard to witness the devastating effect on a sector which last year was at the peak of its success, now facing severe operational restrictions, and as a consequence, rapidly escalating job losses and the inevitable skills drain, which will make it harder to build it back up again in the future. We talk a lot about the costs of the arts, but not always about their value. Today's conversation will explore how the arts and creativity contribute to our mental and physical health. Prediction is that there'll be a lasting impact to mental as well as physical health as a result of the pandemic. Can the arts contribute to helping people stay well? And we'll also talk about artists and the immense challenges that they're facing in this period of time and what we need to do to support artists and freelancers and the vital work that they do for society. Current statistics are stark. Research is evidencing that coronavirus has had a devastating impact on mental health. In a Mind survey of 16,000 people during the lockdown, 2 out of 3, 65% of adults over 25 and 3/4, 75% of young people aged 13 to 24 with an existing mental health problem reported worse mental health. And an ONS survey just published reported that 19.2% of the population of England and Wales reported suffering from some kind of depression in June. This was nearly twice the proportion who reported suffering from depression during the previous 9 months. So I'm joined today by another brilliant group of expert people who will explore whether the arts have a role to play in helping reverse this trend. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a moment. A couple of people haven't joined us yet, so we'll see where we get to begin the conversation, and hopefully they'll be able to join us in a few minutes' time. But before we begin, a couple of housekeeping points. So I'd ask you to save your questions, audience questions, until about halfway through. I'll do my best to take as many as possible, but I'm sure I won't get them all in, so please do forgive me if we don't manage to answer your questions. if you want to ask a question, use the Zoom Q&A function, and you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. We are recording the event, so please do take that into account in answering questions. And if you want to tweet, use the hashtag UOE Culture Conversations. That's UOE Culture Conversations. And be aware that the university's approach to ethics means that we're guided by the principles of dignity, respect for others, integrity, objectivity, and openness. So I'd ask you to present your questions in this context, and we will reserve the right to remove questions if they don't fit within this. So I'd now like to welcome my guests for this evening, or at least some of them. As I say, we're missing a couple of people at the moment. And I'll ask each to say a few words about themselves. So I'm going to start by asking Christine Devaney to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much for having me here, and hello everyone else. I'm Christine Devaney. I'm the artistic director of Edinburgh-based company Curie Seed. We are a dance, if you want to put it into some kind of name, we're a dance theatre company. And I'm still a performer, so I'm still dancing myself. At the heart of our work is dance, movement, and collaboration. So within all that, I direct, I choreograph, I perform sometimes. I've been writing, I facilitate, I mentor. And in relation to, I guess, tonight's conversation, I have a very, personal story in connection to my mental health over the years and my own creativity. And I think through the mentoring that I do with the company, that's where I connect with that mostly. But actually during lockdown, I've been connecting with the importance of that even more for myself and others in different ways. So.
And you have a lovely philosophy on your website, Chris. So I found these beautiful words that say seeds have potential. They're smaller than what they'll become. They push and find their way towards what we need to grow. And different seeds have different patterns of growth, which is reflected in all of your work, I think.
Thank you.
Good. So I will move us on to Susanna Eastburn.
Hi everyone, thanks Janet. Thanks so much for the invitation to be with you today. It's really great to join this very interesting conversation. So I'm Susanna, I'm Chief Executive of Sound and Music. Sound and Music is a national organisation. Our role is to support and champion new music and the work of composers of all ages and all styles of music. We do a range of work in every part of the country. So we do a lot of work in artist development. We do a lot of work around audience development, particularly looking at how people engage online, which I have to say, come lockdown, suddenly made a lot of sense. And also we do some projects in education and sort of underpinning all of that. We have a broader role in terms of advocacy and standing up for people who create music, basically. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanna. And I'll move us swiftly on to Andrew Eaton Lewis, who's joining us from the very north of Scotland, from west of Scotland.
At the most northwesterly point in Britain, in fact.
Wow.
Nothing between us and the Faroe Islands. Thank you, Janet, and hello, everybody. My name is Andrew. I have various hats, which are perhaps worth talking about just very briefly. I was an arts journalist for a very long time, and I still am a little bit of the year. I run the Edinburgh Festival's coverage for the Scotsman and Scotland on Sunday newspapers, which has been an interesting experience this year, certainly. I also am increasingly working as a theatre producer, developing new projects on Lewis in particular, but elsewhere too. I program a winter festival up here called the Hebridean Dark Skies Festival as part of my work for Anlanta Arts Centre in Stornoway. But I'm here kind of mostly in my capacity as in my work for the Mental Health Foundation. I work 2 days a week for the Mental Health Foundation and have been for the past 5 years. I'm part of the programming team for the annual Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival. And I also do various projects that are basically about developing new work, new artistic work about mental health and supporting artists who want to make work exploring mental health.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm going to move us on next to Jackie Wiley. Jackie, thank you for joining us.
Hi everybody, and thanks so much for having me this evening. So I'm the Artistic Director and Chief Executive of the National Theatre of Scotland, and one of the wonderful things about this shift onto digital and online meeting spaces is that I'm going to presume that there's people here from out with Scotland, which allows me to say that the National Theatre of Scotland was the first ever national theatre in the world to be set up without its own building. So National Theatre of Scotland is really proud to use the phrase "without walls." We're a theatre without walls. And what that means is that we believe in defining theatre in whatever way is exciting for audiences and appropriate for the moment in which the theatre is being made. And it also is within the idea of theatre without walls, this kind of inherent commitment to being for everybody in Scotland. So we're just as excited to go and see Andrew with a theatre show up in Lewis as we are to put on work in the Edinburgh International Festival or any of those kind of beautiful big stage platforms. During lockdown, obviously there's been a lot of public discourse around the crisis in the theatre industry in particular, because theatre as an art form is inherently communal. It's about the meeting of real people in real time. And once that's removed, the very nature of theatre making shifts. And we've seen that in the way that there's been a real existential crisis, particularly for the theatre buildings. So National Theatre Scotland has been responding to that in a variety of different ways, and particularly creating a programme of work online that has been about continuing to stay connected with our audiences through our Scenes for Survival programme, and continuing to provide employment opportunities through that work, which I think we'll probably go on to talk about more, as well as other activity for families and young people, and kind of co-created community-driven work as well.
Thank you, Jackie. So as I say, we'll be bringing questions in from the audience about halfway through. So that will be at about 7:15. As I say, we are missing 2 of our panel members, and hopefully I'll get a briefing in relation to what's happened with that, and hopefully we'll be joined by them very soon. But I'm going to kick off the conversation and ask you what your observations have been. All of you have been working with communities and individuals in different settings, and in many different ways over this period. There's been some quite extraordinary work, I think, that has been delivered and led by your organisations and the people that you work with. What have been your observations of the mental health impact of COVID-19? It's clearly been a shocking period for many people, and much uncertainty ahead of us in so many different ways, not just for the artistic community, but particularly for the artistic community in relation to the context of this conversation. So what are the things that you've noticed in terms of how people have responded and had to tackle the challenges of this very serious moment in our history? Susanna, can I ask you to come in on that question?
Yeah, and there's a few things that came into mind as you were talking. I think the first thing to say in terms of artists, and all of us in our different ways are working with a very vast range of artists from all kinds of backgrounds, is that they've coped very differently. Some of them have really appreciated time and space, and my background's obviously in music. Music is a highly globalized industry. People are flying around the world. It was already unsustainable. Everyone exhausted, sort of just zipping around, and actually a number of people have really been relieved to stop. The pressure to go back to that kind of global capitalist way of working, which I think cuts across all the art forms to a greater or lesser extent. The pressure to go back to that will be huge, but it is unsustainable. So that's one thing that in my mind is that there have been artists who have been really thoroughly grateful for more time. The flip side of that is that obviously sort of high degrees of uncertainty and insecurity and the sort of traumatic shock of suddenly people losing such a significant amount of work. And so, you know, so if artists, you know, your identity is bound up in who you are as a creator. It's more than just, it is the thing that you do, it is also the thing that you are. And so this, when that's suddenly removed from you in all the ways that you're used to, that's obviously a hugely traumatic shock. So there have been composers who I've been talking to who have found it very difficult to do any work. And I felt it's an important responsibility for those of us in positions of running organizations and so on to kind of give people space and to sort of just reassure them that lots of people feel like that. So that's one thing, is that it's sort of, there's been interesting responses from artists, and it's been good and bad, I would say, in across different people. But the other thing I was going to note is also this, and this is also to do with audience, it's the sort of the hunger to engage, the hunger to seek solace, to sort of seek something in the arts, to support them. If you know, the listener figures for music in the different radio stations have really shot up. People have really craved that kind of connection, but as they can't articulate this kind of very unprecedented, and you know, it'd be very difficult to describe the situation before it happened. It'd be very hard for us to imagine, and then it happens and we're in it. So, and people have wanted to engage with each other and also with art itself. Those were just a couple of things, but you know, there are many other things that have been noticed.
Thank you, Susanna. And Christine, you had been, I think, about to go on tour. You made a beautiful piece last year called "And the Birds Did Sing," which in a way could almost have been made as a response to coronavirus and not a prelude to it. How have you and your company and people around you that you work with been affected by this period? Dance is also in a very precarious position.
Yeah, very much so. I guess, yeah, I was thinking about the character in the show from last year, Birdie. She was self-isolating and very much in her own world, and I've been thinking about her a lot recently as I've been dancing outside amongst the birds. Can talk a bit more at that. But with the company, yeah, we, like so many companies and artists, everything just stopped. And there is, as Susanna talked about, there's the shock. There's that absolute shock and having to react, like everybody had to react, and then people figuring out, you know, what that shock and trauma and loss is to them, to personally, to your art. You're losing your art. And then I'm working with a team, and so we're all, you know, some of them have children, and so I guess there's just been everybody, as Susanna was talking about, also responding in different ways to the same thing. I guess there's a lot of like everybody unproducing, unplanning, and we're not used to doing that, and that everybody had to do it. So there was a thing about in the arts, people being in there together and somehow support. There was a lot of people needing different things at different times. I kept having this image or feeling that we were people oscillating between on a day when I was managing and being able to see forward, or just managing. Someone else was coming back in the other direction, and as we would pass, there was some sort of feeling of maybe we can connect here and support each other here in this moment of passing. And then I guess with we're just trying to support all the artists we were working with, support each other. You know, we're a really small team, and then I guess within the dance and the theatre community in Scotland, I think that there's been a real sort of resilience it's shown up in terms of how we will reach out and connect and help and share. So there was a time of settling, I feel, and then other things are now coming out of that time of settling. And I guess for me, what do I need myself to help with my own mental health, and starting from that point for me has really, I've done what, and I've sought out what I needed, and I've done what I needed, and that's moving and writing and connecting. And I guess the connecting, I just keep thinking about connecting in different ways, how that's maybe why we're involved in the arts in the first place, because we absolutely understand the need for connection. And we've been disconnected so much through this, and I think a lot of mental health, no matter how severe or passing or whatever, is to do with disconnection. So I think this has been about how do we connect? Yeah, again, so that was, I'm not sure I answered the question, but some thoughts.
Yeah, and absolutely, and Jackie, National Theatre of Scotland, under your leadership, has been producing some extraordinary projects over this period in time. So Scenes for Survival has been quite majestic. You've reached millions and millions of people across the world. You've produced Maka, you've produced some glorious projects for children and families. I saw that you were instigating some work in care homes and work for elders, so much life, much connection. How has everybody dealt with the transition? Presumably you too had a lot of things to undo before you could start putting things back into place again. How's everybody coped?
So because we have national in our title, we felt a particular level of responsibility, and because we don't have a building, there was a certain amount of organisational resilience in a really practical way, because the model of the National Theatre of Scotland is such that we tour to remote places as well as putting on big shows in big theatres. So the interesting thing for us is that because the work that tours is so heavily subsidised, that actually the cancelling of work wasn't an existential crisis for us, because that work is subsidised. So the work that so as soon as we kind of recognised the specificity of that position, we realised that we had this huge responsibility to the rest of the theatre sector. So our job of unproducing, as Chris talked about, was really about making sure that we paid the artists even though that they weren't going to be doing the work, because that was an absolute kind of ethical responsibility that we had. And then that began to open up questions around the value of labour and the relationship between institutions and artists, which are really important things to unpack. And then as we began to produce particularly Scenes for Survival, which has now reached like over 13 million people, 5 continents across the beginning, just being very honest here, we weren't sure if it was the right thing to do, because we were asking artists to make work under conditions and circumstances that were so, in terms of their mental health and their physical and emotional well-being, was it the right thing to do? To, like, a lot of people reacted by saying, we're not going to ask anything of our artists. And then what slowly began to reveal itself was that everybody was responding to the pandemic in different ways. So there were artists who, for them, creativity was the last possible thing that they could anticipate doing, because actually they were thinking about survival, and there was a lot of questions about privilege in there as well. But for other artists, self-expression and self-actualization was exactly what they needed to push themselves through what they were going through. And actually, what's been extraordinary about the work that those artists have given Scotland is that because the artists themselves made the work during this moment, there is now a kind of record, like a living archive of what we've all been through. And some of that is kind of very high profile moments. You know, there's Mark Bonner as a politician rehearsing a confession about breaking the lockdown, but there's Elaine C. Smith as a radio host dealing with the death of her father. And then some of the extraordinary thing is that some of the pieces are the ones that have provided the most comfort and solace in the most surprising ways. So the piece that's had the most views is Janie Godley, which we like. There's nothing surprising about that. But actually, the piece with the second most views is this piece called The Domestic by Euan, which is about the healthcare, the domestic staff within the COVID wards, and about this kind of unseen labour and the kind of saving humanity of the staff that work on the wards, and that the comfort that was offered to Scotland in this moment was, you know, I planned it, but actually, like, it kind of evolved in that moment. So yeah, there's a duality for me about the care required for the artist making the work, and the fact that the work itself is offering a record and a comfort during the times that we're in. Yes,
and all of the work is still available to watch.
Yeah.
And you've set up a hardship fund as well, which people can donate to.
Yeah, so at the time we were trying to join up all of the dots, if you like. So we knew as the National Theatre we had to support the sector, so each of the pieces are done in collaboration with an organisation or a company within Scottish Theatre. But we also were aware that, so we've employed about 300 freelancers over the period of the crisis, but actually that's just a kind of drop in the ocean. So at the beginning we brought on these kind of big name, you know, the celebrities of the literary and acting and theatre world, and we used those names to generate money for the hardship fund. So we're going to be able to give about 25 grants out to those freelancers who are kind of under the most pressure because they aren't within institutions and they aren't salaried. So the kind of balance between those high profile moments, but the high profile moments are really driving a kind of grassroots culture and trying to get money out to those who are really in the most terribly precarious situations.
Thank you, Jackie. And the details of the fund are obviously on the NTS website. Andrew, you have had to do some undoing and some reshaping over this period. How did that work, and how did you judge how to program, and what was the outcome of that in terms of people's engagement?
Big question. Well, we were just about to announce our programme for the Scottish Mental Health Arts Festival at the beginning of March, which is of course when the lockdown happened. I think, and our programme is in May usually, and I think we were probably one of the first festivals due to take place in May to actually announce that we were going to cancel the festival this year. And the reason for that is, I mean, at that point, in fact, it wasn't clear at all how long the lockdown would last. I mean, there were still events kind of programmed for May and June and July. But part of the reason we made the decision to pull the festival was just the anticipation of the stress that would be causing a lot of people, the stress and the uncertainty of just not knowing whether this festival was going to go ahead. So it just made sense to just try and not put people in that position. But it quickly became apparent that, I mean, as we were watching other people start to move things online, there were a lot of things that we could do online, and a lot of work that had already been done, which it would be a shame not to follow through with. Other festivals at that point were looking at moving to a later point in the year, but we are a huge festival. I mean, we're 300 events all over the country, and run by lots of different regional partners. It's not an easy festival to move, so it made sense to try and preserve as much of what we could in May, without obviously putting pressure on people to do events if they didn't want to. So we had our film program, which is our international film competition, which was already, we already had the winners decided. So that just translated into an online screenings over several weeks with discussion events done through Zoom, which seemed to go very well. There was an event about the health and well-being of artists, in fact, called Eat, Move, Sleep, Repeat. which was going to be a day-long symposium, a kind of gathering of artists to talk about strategies for kind of self-care, and that became instead a series of weekly Zoom events, 1 hour long each. And that had a really interesting impact, because I mean, some of the feedback we got on that was that people who would not have been able to go to Glasgow for a whole day, for all kinds of reasons, for not finding it difficult to travel, from social anxiety, from not having the stamina perhaps to do an event that was a whole day long, we're finding these kind of bite-sized weekly, much more discrete events on Zoom really. They were able to engage in that in a way that they might not have been able to. So we did find in a lot of cases that we were opening up to audiences who might not have been able to participate in events. And as well as that, I mean, because Creative Scotland had honoured all of its funding agreements, we had the money to spend. So in a sense, we were in a similar position to Jackie, in that we were in a position to do something to try and support artists who were going through a very difficult time financially, and we felt an obligation to do that. So we were had some commissions. We made a lot of effort to adapt events that we'd already committed to that were going to be live as online events, and find ways to make them work. So, but yeah, I mean, we've had lots of interesting feedback, and on the whole, it seems to be that it has opened up new audiences for the festival, and people who were able to engage with events who might not have been otherwise.
Yes, and I guess there's still research to be done, but that does seem to be a theme that's starting to emerge, that more people, different types of people who potentially previously had been prohibited from engaging with the arts, are able to connect in this kind of new environment. Well,
one anecdotal thing I was going to mention is that there was this, I mean, in the early days of the lockdown, I remember there was this kind of meme going around social media that which was, it's okay not to be at your most productive in a global pandemic, and this was in response to, you know, I suppose everybody being at home, everybody turning to the arts for comfort and entertainment and wisdom, and also an awful lot of artists in very precarious freelance positions feeling an obligation to be creative and to make work because they had to survive. And I think that was there was. Yeah, I mean, some people were able to do that. Some people were able to adapt very quickly and make work in a different way, but a lot of other people were not. So there was a kind of lot of pressure, I think, and expectation around that, which is obviously has its mental health challenges. And the other thing, anecdotally, that was an interesting observation is that the response that we'd had from a few disabled artists that we work with, that in the kind of way of living, this new way of living that everyone seemed to be experiencing, of being isolated, of being at home, this was just normal life for artists with disabilities, and it was. There were some frustrations. I mean, I wouldn't want to speak for people, but there were some frustrations being expressed that there was work being made about the lockdown, and artists with disabilities who seemed, you would think, have the wisdom and the experience and the insight into what it is like living in this situation, but sometimes being excluded from that conversation, which is something that we try to address in an artist commission that we did called My Experience of Isolation, which was very much directed at artists who were experiencing isolation in various ways before the lockdown even happened. So there's been a lot of kind of different considerations. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, as Jackie was saying, that you don't want to put pressure on people to make work in very difficult circumstances. Some people are not able to do that. Some people were able to do that. You've got to try and do your best to kind of, in working with, I mean, we already had a kind of a group of people who we were had committed to working with for this particular festival. So it was a case of working with people to try and figure out what they felt in a position to do, while also honouring our commitment to them.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm just getting an update in terms of the 2 panel members who are on our programme list and who haven't yet managed to attend. We're still tracking them down, but I'll update you as soon as I can. I'm going to move on to another question. We've talked a bit about how the arts have animated and empowered in individuals and communities. Do you have specific examples or stories to tell in relation to either pre-lockdown or during lockdown of particular individuals who've really benefited from the work that you have led or witnessed in relation to the arts and people's health? Susanna, do you have a story for us?
I was actually, in some ways I'd like to talk about a couple of the programs that Sound of Music has been running, but actually so I'll start with that, but then there's actually an anecdote, a sort of personal anecdote, I guess. So I was going to talk about the summer school. We run a summer school every year. It's fantastic. It's for teenage composers, 75 of them. They go to this amazing place in Hertfordshire and have a wonderful week. We took what was in COVID terms an early decision, so that was the end of, it's normally the beginning of August for a week. Yes, COVID terms, an early decision at the end of May that we would make it digital. So as Andrew was saying, at that stage it was still very unclear what was going to be possible or not, and we just thought actually we can deliver something better if we just start planning now. And we learned a huge amount, and all the things that other panelists have said about kind of how it actually opens people up, and there are ways that people can create in their own front rooms that in a other setting they might be too shy or whatever to speak up. And then hearing both from the tutors, hearing the tutors say what it had meant to make music with each other again was incredibly moving. And a couple of the tutor groups, there's like 4 or 5 musicians kind of worked together to bring pieces that the young people have created to life. And a couple of them actually sort of found ways of doing it in the same physical space that was socially distanced, and hearing them talk about what it had meant to play music together was incredibly moving. But then actually on the day, hearing what the young people had said about what it had meant to do this week on the sort of digital course and work remotely with the musicians and to create and express themselves and be supported to do that was unbelievably moving. And to hear the work they had created, which wasn't specifically about lockdown or anything, but it was sort of, it was about where they were at. And so I don't know if that's it. It was a kind of coming together because it was a very collective experience. The anecdote about my sort of a personal anecdote really was that at the beginning of lockdown, so we talked about the traumatic shock. I was already in traumatic shock because my mother died very unexpectedly in December. So I was off for much of January and February, sort of dealing with all of that, and I came back from compassionate leave, was 3 weeks in the office, and then lockdown happened, and I was already kind of cognitively quite affected. And I don't know if others found this, that thing where like when your computer's backing up and everything's whirring quite slowly. I was sort of experiencing that anyway, and then lockdown started. And one of the things I found that helped me was I started having viola lessons via Zoom. So I was actually playing my instrument. And it's not playing music even, it was sort of doing technical stuff, and it sort of sounds, some of it sounds horrible and you're just sort of scratching away. And but the effect of doing this and playing every day was remarkable. And every time I played, my brain would feel sort of so fuzzy and numb, and then I'd play and practice and make these horrible sounds, and the effect was like smoke clearing. And so after half an hour I would feel measurably sharper and better able to think, and my mental health would have kind of improved greatly. So it's sort of remarkable what the act of doing can do in situations like that.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you so much for telling us that story. And there is research, much research in place, some of which has been spearheaded by Daisy Fancourt, who was going to join us this evening and is now unable. But in researching myself for this evening, I came across a piece of work from 2011, which came out of McGill University in Montreal, which talks about music releasing a chemical in the brain that has a key role in setting good moods. So the report was called Nature Neuroscience, and it found that a chemical was released at the moments of peak in enjoyment. So, and that was apparently the first time that the chemical dopamine has been tested in response directly to music, which is extraordinary, and clearly evidencing itself in terms of your own practice. And I'm sure, like many of us on this panel, music is just something that can be so soothing when we're trying to process complicated emotional realities. I've certainly put the radio on, listened to music, and even quietly by myself played the piano for my own self-enjoyment, which just makes a real difference, I think, when you have those points when you just think, how on earth are we going to deal with everything that we're currently faced with? Chris, you have done a lot of work with communities, with children and young people, with people with disabilities. You co-produced another beautiful piece of work called We Are All Just Little Creatures, which I think only had 2 outings in terms of venue location because of the complexity of the work. I was privileged enough to see one of those in the Travis Theatre in Edinburgh. What I got from that performance was a real sense of people who had come together, connected as a community, but also people for whom the power of the arts was transformative in terms of their own personal well-being and sense of self, and their sense of joy. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? And I suppose what you learned over the course of working with that particular community of artists and people from different communities in relation to their transformation through that experience.
Oh yeah, well, I guess when you talk about when you mention the belief in the transformative power of being involved in the arts, it makes me think that's why we're all here. We absolutely know it and believe it in our bones. And so I think that's been in me for years. And let's say the sort of the benefits of being involved in the arts. It's almost like a sort of sometimes a side thing, the sort of the medicine of it, sometimes a side thing. But through working, that particular project was with a co-production with Longha Theatre Company, who have been in Edinburgh for years, 30 years I think, or more than 30 years, and all their members, the performers, have some kind of disability, like physical, and some learning difficulties. And a company, Lyra, who work for children, and then it was us. So that was some professional dancers and professional musicians. So that's a huge group. There was about 27 people on stage, all ages, all abilities, pros, non-pros, and I love working like that. And it's interesting thinking about that project in relation to now, because a much smaller project, I guess, that I sort of embarked on at the beginning of lockdown. A couple of the members of from Longha Theatre Company have been coming. One in particular, the wonderful Gavin, has come to every session. I started a 3-minute dance and writing and drawing session right almost at the beginning of lockdown, because I panicked myself about my own well-being, and so I was, what do I need? Okay, my 3-minute moving and writing process practice has meant so much to me the last few years. So I started on my own at the beginning of lockdown, and I was like, oh, I want to do this with others. So I opened it out and invited anybody from the dance community that wanted to come along, and I was doing it 6 days a week initially, and Gavin from Longha has come. It's not 6 days anymore. It's 4 days. I've handed over facilitating it to Gavin from Lungha, because he's just been there. And the writing and the connection and the sharing that's come from that is kind of similar to the work on that huge production. So for me, that the sort of ethos of the creativity in the room is what's going to make what's going to make the show. The show was amazing. The show is amazing, but it's all the understories. You know, it's all the unseen work that we know that is also the support for all our mental health and everybody who takes part, their mental well-being. So there's the show, and then I think so the understories and the unseen magic that keeps us well. Yeah.
Yes, and if we did have Daisy with us, she would be talking about her report, which was produced at the end of last year for WHO, World Health Organization Europe, and it chimes with what you're saying, Christine. So the first part of that report focuses on prevention and promotion, so how the arts can affect social determinants of health, support child development, encourage health promoting behaviours, help to prevent the development of mental and physical illness, and support caregiving. And then the second section focuses on how the arts can support in the management and treatment of mental illness, neurodevelopmental and neurological disorders, and non-communicable diseases, as well as supporting the delivery of acute care and palliative care. So really serious work there. And I think that the challenge, I suppose, for all of us is finding the right language as people working in the cultural sector to be able to slot into the health system in a way that doesn't detract from the motivation and the point and purpose of why people create and make art, but in a way where it's relevant and where it's viable. The arts can benefit from having that alliance in terms of the health system and what it's trying to do. And I suppose I'm really interested in that sense of both prevention and cure. It just strikes me that much of the work that artists do and regular engagement with the arts is often profoundly preventative in that it gives people nourishment and energy and a sense of self and ability to be able to work through challenges and problems, sometimes in ways that people who don't engage in the arts perhaps struggle with. Is that something, Jackie, that you've had experience of, perhaps at National Theatre of Scotland, but also prior in relation to the different roles that you've played within the arts field?
Yeah, I think we also have to recognise that there's no one stable experience at the moment, and I'm just like listening to all of us, and it's just made me think about a conversation I had recently where I was in like my usual mode as artistic director of National Theatre of Scotland, and we were doing a planning process with a particular local authority who people who live in that postcode have experienced not just a spike, so there's two different spikes in terms of like where the mortality rates are happening in relation to COVID. So there's COVID deaths, but then there's also the terrible impact, both in terms of mental health, but also just in terms of the kind of demolishment of people's ability to survive, which is really different depending on whereabouts in Scotland that you live. So I went into a conversation about a participatory project and used the usual language that I would use about how the importance of co-creating with communities and all of the kind of language that we would use. And actually, the person I was in the conversation with from the local authority was like, it's actually not appropriate to talk about the arts in that way at the moment because there's this humanitarian crisis going on, and it was really described to me as a humanitarian crisis. So there's something interesting that I don't have answers, but I've just got questions around the need for us as leaders in the arts to fight even harder for the value of what we're doing, because we know exactly what Chris said, we know in our souls of this transformative power of the work that we do, but we also have to remember the kind of structural inequalities that exist that mean that for some people, the idea of participating in the arts is completely alien because they're actually fighting for their survival, which is just something about the COVID crisis that has opened up that conversation in a really stark way.
Indeed. And Andrew, you're nodding there. Do you want to contribute to that line of thought?
I don't have anything fully prepared on this, but no, I was nodding because I recognize what Jackie is saying, that it's the difficulty sometimes of justifying arts spending when you're faced with the response, why should it? I mean, this was true long before COVID. I mean, you know, the argument that you're constantly up against with arts funding is, well, why should it should be spent on hospital beds? You know, it should be spent on people on crisis situations. There are always, I mean, you can list any number of things that are considered more urgent and than arts funding, and it's very difficult to argue with that sometimes. But I don't know. I don't have an answer to that either. That it is particularly true now, but on the other hand, this situation has also demonstrated how much people take solace in the arts, and how much the arts are important to mental health, and how much also mental health is tied to a crisis in physical health. You know, COVID, as we've seen, has had this huge impact on people's mental health. And maybe we create problems for ourselves sometimes by talking about the arts, because you know, that way of describing it is alien to a lot of people. You know, there are a lot of, but so many people who don't think of themselves as participating in the arts are creative, participate in things which are creative, and without even thinking about it. It's an essential part of the human experience, even if you don't call it that. You know, I mean, it used to really frustrate me when I was a journalist that the section I was editing, the name for the section I was editing, the arts section, was constantly described in ways that I didn't quite approve of. You know, I was described as arts and entertainment, or arts and film, or arts and music, as if these are, you know, as if these are different things. You know, there is this general perception that the arts is something worthy or something very middle class, you know, but you know, Netflix is the arts. Rave music is the arts. You know, it just depends on how you frame it. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where this is going, but yeah.
I think there's also something about different experiences in terms of mental health across age ranges as well. Like at National Theatre Scotland, we've had a particular focus on the experience of young people, and the reason that we chose to do that was because we had a sense that it is increasingly harder for young people to imagine an optimistic future, which is a really devastating fact to process. But for me, you know, I came to sort of intellectual consciousness, if you like, whatever the grew up, I don't know what the word is, but like I was a teenager in the 1990s, which was a very optimistic time, whereas young people at the moment, because of the climate crisis, because of, you know, increasing inequalities, because of the kind of collapse of trust amongst the political system, and now COVID, and also this kind of increasing conversation, like a civil rights conversation, all of that, just the job of the arts for me, which is indisputable and, you know, is at the heart of how we make the case for why we're so vital, is that we are actually able to allow young people to imagine, or empower young people towards optimism, and that is the job of, I think that's the job of work that we should all invest in. And then again, there's an extreme of age as well around the kind of absolute loss of hope amongst older people because of the COVID crisis. So there's something around the extremes of generations and the role of arts in trying to imagine optimism that I'm just trying to sort of process myself at the moment.
Yeah, and that's important in every layer of society, and probably very important in relation to the economy as well, in helping people find creative solutions for whatever it is that they want to build and generate. Susanna, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to underline what's just been said about this dichotomy between, is it hospital beds or the arts, is really unhelpful. And the fact is, it's never it's never one or the other. That's not how politics works. And again, I completely sort of echo and understand everything that Jackie's just said. If you think about young people, of course they need their physical needs met. Of course they need to be properly looked after, fed, housed, clothed. Of course they do. And they need their emotional, creative needs met. They need both for every reason. They need both. And because I agree, I think to be a young person right now is really, really challenging. And the thing that will help them, I can't think of anything else that will help them as well as the arts and engaging in the arts. And yes, it is about trying to be optimistic, but I think it's also has to be about how you navigate kind of almost overwhelming emotions. So that rage, anger, confusion, all of that is part of what the arts can do as well. So yeah, I just wanted to really say it's sort of we need both. We all need both.
I was just going to say a little thing in response to that. I'm thinking about, you know, when Andrew was talking about the arts and how sometimes that can make it other than or separate, and in relation to especially, well, young people, about creativity. And I read a lovely quote about from Sir Ken Robinson this morning about we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. And I was just like, that's one thing that I just think in primary school, young people are expected, encouraged, naturally creative. And then it seems, and you know, that keeps young people growing and nurturing and through creativity, some more than others, but they're naturally creative. And then something happens, the summer holiday happens, and they go to secondary school, and it's almost taken away. And I just, you know, I've got this utopian dream about it. We would just be encouraged to somehow stay connected to that creativity from primary school onwards. It's not just for some, it's for everybody, and that would carry on some, you know, in a much clearer, stronger way into people's lives through education, and then we maybe take it with us into beyond, you know, school age.
Thank you, Chris. And we should pay tribute to the late Ken Robinson, who very sadly passed away this last weekend. Huge advocate of arts and culture and creativity. He has some wonderful and inspirational TED Talks up on his website. So if anybody's interested, you can go and find those there. So I am going to open up to some questions or points from the audience, if anybody's got any for our panel members this evening. And while people are scratching their heads and thinking about that, I want to move us on to a practical question. So all of you are involved in different types of health work in one way or another, or have experience of that. We've talked about what artists need. So what kind of conditions need to be in place to maximise the contribution of artists working in public health settings? What would be the optimum environment in order for the arts sector to be able to contribute in the way that it wants to? Jackie, can I bring you in on that question? You've just advertised, I think.
We've just advertised. We've been inviting proposals for artists to offer their response to what care means in contemporary Scotland. I think there's some incredibly radical shifts or models that are taking place around like the role of artists or the role of creativity in every aspect of life. So rather than it being, you know, at NTS we can facilitate artistic projects, but what does it mean to have artists embedded in institutions that are not artistic over the long term to shift their organizational cultures? Or what does it mean to have creative responses or creatives embedded through all elements of society and all geographies? And I think there's some really interesting models around valuing the kind of act of creative thinking as well as the artistic output. For me, there's something around collaboration. One of the projects I've been kind of most I feel has made most of a difference to people's lives is a project we did last year called Like Flying, which was the National Theatre of Scotland collaborating with SAMH, the Scottish Association for Mental Health. And we started off with this question, which was about how National Theatre of Scotland could have a positive impact on young people's mental health. And I, like at the beginning of that project, thought that we were going to go and do a kind of collaborative project in schools where we discussed with like young people's mental health with them. And by working with SAMH, what they sort of unpacked for us was that it is physically doing or physically the act of creativity itself that is the important part of the equation. So we ended up doing this project where we taught aerial skills. So we taught like trapeze, silks. We went into schools and designed this whole project, which was about teaching children what it felt like to fly. So Like Flying was what it was called in the end, which was about the kind of physical experience of moving through space. And what was so brilliant about that project was that the feedback that we got from the young people in the schools was that like the overriding message was that like they felt alive. So there was no conversation about mental health, no intellectual processing of their anxieties, but it was like this project allowed these young people to physically go out of their own bodies to feel alive and forget about all of the other anxieties in their bodies. And we wouldn't have got to that project if we hadn't collaborated across sectors in that way, because we didn't have the expertise. We did have the kind of artistic vision in the artists that we supported to work on that project. So yeah, I think there's something about collaboration and there's something about COVID that all kind of formality and structures of how we communicate and collaborate have all kind of gone in a really good way. Like I have like, there's so many doors to conversation that normally would have taken me weeks to, you know, put into place and figure out what the terms of engagement were for everybody. Now we can all just open up our hearts and our kind of like working souls to new conversations, and if we can somehow channel some of that, I think it would be a really positive. Yeah, it's a positive set of possibilities.
It's almost as if we're in a period of living laboratory on all fronts, and you know, while there are lots of things that are very fearful in that, there are also green shoots and chinks of light, perhaps, where we can start to challenge the status quo and look at new ways of doing things which could potentially be productive in the future. Andrew, I'm going to go back to that question of what are the practical things that need to be in place for artists to be able to work well in different kinds of health settings. You've much experience in this area.
Well, some kind of indirectly, I guess. I think, and kind of echo what Jackie said a little bit, a lot of it is about dialogue and building up trust and understanding each other's languages, which is something we've been trying to do in various different ways over the years. I mean, for 3 years we ran an annual symposium called The Dust of Everyday Life, where we had kind of an equal mix of people from the health sector and people from the arts sector, and kind of put them together on panels, and found that there was lots of very interesting common ground, which is something we're able to do, because I mean, quite unusually, I think we're an arts festival that is historically been largely funded by the health sector. You know, we are funded by the NHS, among other health organisations, but that is possible only because from a long time of building up relationships, of building up trust, and talking to each other. And obviously, these organisations are always pressed in terms of funding, and so you need people on the inside who are advocates for the arts, and we are lucky to have that. But there was a report quite recently by the Bearing Foundation, which is a kind of a mapping exercise of arts and mental health projects all over the UK, and which they have done as kind of the starting point of a theme that they're going to have over the next few years. That the Bearing Foundation's kind of focus is going to be on arts and mental health. And I noticed one of the interesting discoveries they made was the vast majority of the projects across the UK that they had mapped out were funded by arts funders on the national lottery, largely, rather than the health sector. So and also run by kind of small organisations rather than big organisations. So yeah, I mean, it can be an uphill struggle sometimes, but yeah, it's about learning to speak each other's language, I think, and finding out what artists need from those settings and what healthcare providers need as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to just take the points from the Q&A. So we've got a point about visual arts, and wondering if people are trying to cope with the pandemic using visual art in Europe. The Scottish Arts and Mental Health Festival works across art disciplines. Do you have some examples of visual arts projects that have played into your programme this year or in previous years?
Yeah, well, I just worked on one on the Isle of Lewis, actually. See Me, the National Anti-Mental Health Stigma campaign, has been doing an art commission, and we worked with a couple of artists on Lewis on a participatory art project, working with 3 local mental health service providers, where they did workshops where people learned how to make these very beautiful wooden boxes, and they would design the boxes and would fill the boxes with objects that were meaningful to them, and they could be small pieces of artwork that they made, or they could just be things that they found, or and that was going to be an exhibition at Atlanta in Stornoway, which was due to open in April, but it has that did end up becoming part of our online program this year. So I mean, it's not quite the same as having these, this tactile experience of boxes and being able to kind of handle them, which obviously you can't do now. But there were some really beautiful photos on the Mental Health Festival website. And the other thing that we did, we had an online gallery, which is ongoing, on which we're adding things to all the time from various places around Scotland that we're going to run the exhibitions. And in October, we're due to have a big exhibition called Out of Sight, Out of Mind, which has been at Summer Hall in Edinburgh for the past few years. Which is a huge group exhibition of artists who have various mental health experiences. I think they're still kind of making decisions about what form that exhibition is going to take at the moment, but yeah, it may well be. I need to check, but it may be that there is a kind of more sort of online element to it this year. But yeah, but visual art has been a big part of what we've done for quite a long time.
Thank you. And I'm just going to join up the dots with something that you've just said, that in the Bearing overview, much of the work that was produced for health settings was funded through arts funding directly. And I suppose picking up on other things that I've read, and I suppose the question to the whole panel, do you think that there are more opportunities than we're currently exploiting for co-funding arts and health projects? Is there more opportunity in that space? And I suppose I'm particularly thinking, if we've got health providers in the audience, are there more opportunities to connect and come together around providing arts and health opportunities for people to engage with. But before I just throw that question out to all of you, and maybe you could have a think about who would like to put their hand up and answer it. We've got a comment from Anna Wheeler, who's a comment on the arts or hospital beds point, who's telling us that playwright James Graham made a good case for this on BBC Question Time on the 21st of May this year. It's not an equivalence whereby arts funding costs hospital beds. We can pay for more hospital beds with our films, our television shows and our theatres. So she sent through a link to his excellent comments on how the arts are integral, not separate to life, which we can share with anybody who wants to have it. If you email us, we'll be happy to do that. And then another question that's coming through from the States, do we see street art as beneficial? But before I take that, back to my question about co-producing arts and health projects. Is that something that happens? Is that something that there should be more of? And how would we find the right language or connections to generate those kinds of opportunities? Susanna, can I come to you on that question?
I don't feel very qualified to give a very academically robust answer, but I guess I'm still kind of thinking about your question before. It does relate to it, so bear with me. It's something about the conditions in which this work happens well. I think there will be more opportunities. The thing that the arts have to continue to get better at, and actually particularly arts funders, although some are being more enlightened about it, is this whole thing about it being it doesn't have a fixed end, that we don't necessarily know what we're going to get to. And it's interesting that at Sound and Music, our artist development program, New Voices, we identify the artists and then work with them to design the collaborations, the work they're going to do. It's been incredibly difficult to fundraise for. We're speaking amongst friends now, so I'll speak frankly, really difficult to fundraise for because people don't know what people say the outcomes aren't clear. And it's like, well, we don't yet know what's going to happen. So finding ways of working, which I think would probably be quite fruitful, working in other settings, which are more of an exploration and a chance to find things out along the way, feels really important. And I'd also sort of say as an aside, if one of the things we for sure have learned during the pandemic, that you can plan as much as you like, but something can happen and everything goes out of the window and you have to kind of figure out as you go. So I kind of, if we can find ways of working that don't start from, that start with kind of the why, what is it you want, why do we want to do this together, what is it we want to get to, rather than sort of starting with a kind of fixed endpoint, I think feels like a really important starting point for that kind of collaborative work, and potentially sort of super exciting and a different way of looking at things too.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to Jackie's point about opening up the imagination amongst young people, which to me feels so critical at this point, to be able to gift confidence to young people, to be able to imagine how we can stabilize and reshape and reinvest in life and the way the world works in the future. So absolutely, I completely concur with you on that front. Chris, do you think that there are more opportunities to collaborate across sectors, particularly with the health sector, in different and new ways? And have you experience of that? And do you have any thought in terms of how that conversation could be initiated?
I don't personally have a huge amount of experience with that. I guess my response is like, as a very small company and as an artist, how to find those connections. I would love someone to come to us, or someone to point us in the right direction around that kind of work, because I completely believe that it's, and now would be a good time. The word that keeps coming to my head also is about quality. That the doing, the process, every part of the process is taken care of. The people are taken care of in any of these future collaborations across sector and with arts and health, creativity and health. That so the artists are taken care of, the work is taken care of, the people who are working, the process is as important, more important, that as than Susanna says, than the outcome. So how do we really take care of that and make sure that that every part of the collaboration process is quality work, as in, you know, a quality experience, you know. And so I would love, actually, as an artist and with my company, to try and forge those kinds of connections, and also so that not to the detriment of the, sometimes I you know, as you say, talking amongst friends, sometimes those kind of collaborations maybe could be seen as being lesser than the other work, you know, maybe it's not as shiny. And how do we make sure that any work is of quality for everyone? Yeah.
And one thought I've often had in relation to arts and health is that health cures are if they're defined by research. So research and experimentation is fundamental to getting it right. And there's space and time and investment in that research and experimentation in order to get to a positive outcome. Do you think that there's more opportunity to embrace research and experimentation in relation to the way that the arts work in Scotland and the UK and the world? Should there be more opportunity to test and trial, experiment without the need for outcomes at the end of every project? And what would need to be in place in order to be able to give courage to new kinds of investment that would underpin that? Andrew, do you want to have a go at that?
I want to have a go at that. Can I answer this in a slightly tangential way? I was just remembering, as everyone else was talking, about a project that I really enjoyed working on a few years ago called Declaration, which was kind of an arts festival, but it was funded by the Health and Social Care Alliance. And it was intended to be a human rights event, or a human rights festival, exploring different issues around human rights. And I thought it was a really interesting way of bringing these different worlds together, because what we decided to do in quite a creative way, I thought, was do 40 events, each one focusing on a different part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so over the course of 4 days, you had things which were very much arts events, I suppose, film screenings and spoken word and film, alongside things which were an event, for example, run by Freedom from Torture, and an event about transgender stories, and there was an event where just one of my favorite events, where 3 generations of asylum seekers told their stories of coming to Britain and their lives here, and because it was 3 different generations, you get very different perspectives on how, on social attitudes and various other things, which was a storytelling event. But something about, there was something about that whole program that seemed to, we managed to create an arts festival that the Health and Social Care Alliance seemed very happy with in the end as funders, because it did have clear outcomes in terms of knowledge and learning and sharing of resources, but it also had a freedom to experiment and to take risks and do things which didn't really have very clear outcomes, but were just, you know, performance and storytelling for the sake of sharing something. So this is a slightly roundabout answer, but I suppose what I'm saying is the way is to kind of think creatively and try and find out how you can create something that has a kind of clear outcome in a way that people in the health sector would want, but also has an artistic integrity as well. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is possible.
Thank you. And Jackie, sort of same question to you really. Do you feel that you're able to experiment as the artistic director of a large national organisation, or do you witness that the sector at large has the opportunity to experiment, or do you feel that there's still space for more research and development in the cultural environment that we function in?
I mean, National Theatre Scotland has a particular responsibility, and I would never dare to answer the question about whether or not the Scottish arts sector is experimental enough, because I'd be
Yeah.
But an example that's really on my mind at the moment, because is a show that we just restaged in various in the Ghostlight film that we did with the EIF and in the Edinburgh Festival recently, which is the story of Adam Kashmiri. I don't know if anybody else saw Adam, but Adam's story is one of, Adam was a trans man that was born in Egypt and moved to Scotland to go through the process of identity as a new Scottish man. And actually the way that story is profoundly about mental health, because it's about Adam finding his sense of self, or his sense of like fundamental place in the world and overcoming all of the challenges. And at the time it felt really like quite a challenging prospect for National Theatre Scotland, because it was a person telling their own story, and Adam, not a trained actor, and we made that. It was Cora Bissett that met Adam, and we made that work before there was the kind of national spotlight on the trans experience that there is now. But actually, I think there's something about the importance of taking risks on the types of stories that we tell, which is not me answering your question, Janet, but the place where I'm having to push myself is to make sure that we're not telling stories that reflect a safe version of Scottishness back to us, because that's comforting. It's much more important to sort of unveil the complexity of Scotland. And I'm thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, and the kind of crisis that is opening up for all of us as Scottish people, having to deal with our colonial history. And, you know, maybe it's not so much about the need for experiment, but the need to be brave about the versions of Scottishness that we're willing to explore through the art that we make.
Thank you, Jackie. Very important point there, and it segues beautifully into a audience member question. So linked to Black Lives Matter. So coming from the States, do any of you see street art as beneficial, especially to people from working class environments? And David Villegas is asking this question directly in the context of the recent riots against racial injustice in the States. Would any of you have a response to that particular question? Andrew?
I would just say that all art forms are valid. I mean, I can't think of any reason why street art wouldn't be valid. Yeah. It'd be a really interesting thing to explore, and has been. There are lots of very good street artists in Scotland who do workshops with schools. With I'm thinking of people like Amy Whiten. Yeah,